You say yes to something you already know you don't have the energy for. Maybe it's another late night conversation when you're exhausted. Maybe it's listening a little longer, explaining a little more, smoothing something over so the tension doesn't grow. In the moment, it feels reasonable. You tell yourself it's not a big deal. Relationships require flexibility, right? But later, something in you feels tight and unsettled. Not because the request was terrible, but because a quiet line inside you got crossed. And if this feels familiar, stay with me. You're listening to Coupled With, the podcast that helps you take the guesswork out of feeling seen, heard, and valued in your relationship. If you've ever felt stuck in the same arguments, struggled to stay connected, or wondered how to better communicate with your partner, you're in the right place. I'm Dr. Rachel Orleck, a couples therapist and coach, and together, we're going to make relationships make sense. Let's dive in. A lot of people think boundaries in relationships are about controlling someone else's behavior. We imagine they sound firm and obvious, clear lines, clear rules, but most of the boundaries people struggle with aren't dramatic like that. They're subtle. They're the moments when you override your own capacity in order to keep the connection steady. You keep the conversation going even though your nervous system is tired. You stretch your patience past the point where it actually feels honest. You stay accommodating because you don't want to risk being seen as difficult, selfish, or too much. And the tricky thing is, this pattern usually starts from a very understandable place. Many of us were taught that being a good partner means being flexible, easygoing, and emotionally generous. Particularly if you were socialized as a woman, there's often a deep expectation that maintaining harmony is part of your role in a relationship. So when tension shows up, your instinct isn't to pause and check your limits. Your instinct is to smooth it out. At first, that strategy works beautifully. It helps keep things calm. It keeps the relationship moving. But over time, something else begins to happen under the surface. Because when you repeatedly stretch past your own capacity to keep the bond intact, the relationship slowly organizes itself around the version of you that is always willing to bend. What this often looks like in real life is not some huge boundary violation. It's much quieter. You stay in the conversation when you're already depleted because you don't want to seem avoidant. You say yes to plans, emotional processing, closeness, reassurance, or problem solving when some part of you is already waving a tiny white flag in the background. Sometimes it's holding your own distress when your partner says they need space, even though every instinct inside you wants to keep reaching for the connection. You keep going, not because you're dishonest, but because overriding yourself has become so normal that it barely even registers as a choice anymore. It just feels like what good, loving, emotionally responsible people do. And because it feels loving, it's easy to miss the cost. On the outside, you may look patient, flexible, deeply relational, someone who's willing to meet the moment. But on the inside, there's often a different experience unfolding. There's fatigue. There's pressure. There's that subtle feeling of being internally cornered when you're still participating, but your body is no longer really with you. And then later, maybe even much later, the reaction comes out sideways. You feel irritated by something small. You pull back emotionally without fully understanding why. You start keeping score in ways you don't feel proud of, not because you're petty, but because something in you knows you've been paying for connection with your own capacity. This is one of the reasons people get so confused in relationships. They think the problem is that they're too nice, or that their partner is asking for too much, or even that they just need better communication. Sometimes those things matter, but often the deeper issue is the relationship has quietly gotten organized around the version of you that keeps stretching. The version of you that says, I can do a little bit more. I can hold this too. I'm fine. I'm fine. And if you do that often enough, the system begins to treat that overextension like the baseline reality. So when you finally start feeling resentful, numb, or strangely lonely inside a relationship that technically looks functional, that reaction rarely comes out of nowhere. It's usually the delayed emotional bill for all the moments you left yourself out of that equation. The self-betrayal doesn't happen in one dramatic moment. It happens in tiny, socially rewarded increments, in being easy, in being accommodating, in being low maintenance, being the one who can handle it, until one day, that part of you that can handle everything quietly starts wondering why it always has to. What makes this pattern tricky is that it often gets framed as virtue for a very long time. You are praised for being flexible, thoughtful, emotionally aware, willing to meet people where they are, and those qualities are not the problem. The problem is that they can quietly fuse with a much older belief. That closeness is preserved by managing yourself better, needing less, and staying easy to be with. So what looks like generosity on the surface can actually be a nervous system bargain underneath. I will not make this harder. I will not add friction. I will not be the one who tips this into disconnection. That's why people often misunderstand boundaries. They think the work is learning how to tell other people what they can and cannot do. But a lot of the time, that's not the first issue. The first issue is that you've already passed your own limit before you even think to name it. You've already decided to stay, explain, soothe, stretch, tolerate, absorb. By the time the word boundary enters the conversation, you're often already resentful, flooded, or quietly disappearing inside the interaction. So the deeper reframe here is that the boundary many people avoid most is not with their partner. It's with themselves. It's the internal line where your capacity ends and your self-abandonment begins. And there are a lot of reasons that line gets blurry. If you were taught explicitly or implicitly that having needs makes you difficult, selfish, or high maintenance, then of course you learned to edit yourself. Of course you became skilled at accommodation. Your body learned that preserving connection mattered more than preserving your internal truth. Particularly for women, that lesson often gets wrapped into praise. Be kind, understanding, don't overreact, don't make it a thing. And all of that sounds reasonable until you realize that it can train you to override your own reality in extremely polished ways. You don't look dysregulated. You actually look mature. Meanwhile, your nervous system is in the background saying that this is absolutely not fine. And when that goes on long enough, unmet needs rarely disappear. They simply stop arriving through the front door. They come in sideways through irritability, distance, scorekeeping, numbness, overthinking, sudden tears, or that strange feeling of being emotionally lonely while sitting next to somebody you love. So here's the belief I want to gently challenge. Sacrificing your own capacity does not make a relationship safer. It may make it smoother in the short term, but smooth is not the same as secure. So when you look at this pattern through an attachment and nervous system lens, it begins to make a lot of sense. If your system learned early that closeness became shaky or unpredictable, tense or emotionally expensive, it would naturally start searching for ways to reduce that instability. One very intelligent strategy is accommodation. You stay soft and available, easy to connect with, and you don't add much weight in the moment. Don't be the one who makes this harder. That is not weakness. That is adaptation. Your body is trying to protect the bond by lowering the chances of a rupture, even if the way it does that is now costing you. And the cost is not always obvious in the moment because accommodation often feels relational. It feels loving and mature. It feels like I'm being the steady one here. But nervous systems are sneaky like that. A strategy can feel virtuous and still be protective. What matters is not just how the behavior looks from the outside, but what function it serves on the inside. Stretching because you freely want to is very different from stretching because some part of you believes the relationship becomes less safe the second you have a limit. Those two things may look identical from across the room, but internally, they come from completely different places. And it's important to be fair to both people in the relationship here. Your partner may have no idea that your yes is happening at the expense of you. They may simply be responding to the version of you they've come to know, the one who keeps talking, keeps processing, keeps making room. Relationships learn from repetition. If one person consistently overrides their limits to preserve closeness, the system begins to treat it as normal. And if your partner tends to be more withdrawing or simply slower to process, your accommodation can unintentionally hide the full shape of the pattern. Because while you are managing your own distress and extending the conversation, they may never fully feel the distance between the two of you. The bridge keeps getting built before they even have a chance to step onto it, which means the relationship can actually appear more functional than it is. Not because no one cares, but because one nervous system has been quietly stabilizing the connection for two. Quick pause here, because what we're talking about in this episode is often part of a larger pattern. One partner starts trying harder to hold the relationship together, the other partner starts pulling back, and both nervous systems end up feeling more and more overwhelmed. If that dynamic feels familiar, I made something that might help. It's a free 10-minute training called Why Love Feels Like Too Much, where I explain the cycle that escalates both partners, and a short nervous system reset that can help you interrupt the spiral before it turns into another painful fight. You can find it at the link in the show notes. All right, coming back to what we were talking about. That moment where you can feel yourself stretching past capacity in order to keep the relationship steady. Changing this pattern rarely looks dramatic. It usually doesn't begin with a big declaration or a perfectly worded boundary conversation. Most of the time, it starts with a very quiet internal shift where you begin noticing the moment your capacity actually ends. Not where you think it should end, not where a good partner would keep going, just the honest edge of what you genuinely have available in that moment. And that moment can feel surprisingly uncomfortable. Because if your nervous system is used to maintaining connection through accommodation, the second you stop stretching, the whole system can feel pretty wobbly. Your brain may immediately start predicting problems. Maybe they'll think I'm pulling away, or maybe this will create distance, or I'm being selfish right now. None of those thoughts mean the relationship is actually in danger. They simply are echoes of an old rule your body learned a long time ago. Connection stays safe when you manage yourself carefully. So, when you begin honoring your limits instead, your nervous system can temporarily read that as risky. This is also where people sometimes misinterpret what growth looks like inside a relationship. They expect the change to immediately feel relieving, but very often the first stage feels a little awkward instead. The rhythm shifts, the timing changes. The person who used to carry the emotional momentum slows down, and the relationship has to adjust to this new pacing. That adjustment can look like pauses in conversations, moments where neither person immediately fixes the tension, or space where both people have time to sit with the discomfort instead of one person quickly absorbing it. Those pauses are not signs that something has gone wrong. They're often signs that the system is slowly reorganizing. Because when you stop overriding yourself, something important becomes visible that was harder to see before. Your partner now has room to respond differently. They may step forward, they may need time, they may initially feel unsure about this new pacing. But the relationship is no longer being quietly stabilized by one nervous system doing all the work in the background. The emotional balance begins to become shared instead of privately managed. And that shift, even though it can feel unfamiliar and uncomfortable at first, is where reciprocity starts to grow. So, if you're listening to this and reorganizing yourself, the shift here is not to suddenly become rigid or shut down or start announcing boundaries like you're reading from a hostage negotiation manual. The shift is much quieter than that. It's learning to notice the moment you're about to agree to something your body does not actually have the capacity for. Not 5 hours later when you're feeling resentful, not 3 days later when you're emotionally hungover and picking a fight over the dishwasher placement, right there in the moment where your yes is about to outrun your actual bandwidth. And in that moment, the most useful question is surprisingly simple. Do I have the capacity for this right now? Not forever, not as a judgment about the relationship, not as a character assessment about you or your partner, just this moment, just this nervous system, just this amount of emotional bandwidth. Because if the answer is no and you override it anyway, you are already paying for the interaction before it has finished happening. Interrupting the pattern early matters. It allows you to catch the self-abandonment closer to the source instead of discovering it later through resentment or distance. And the goal here is not to become less loving. It's to become more honest about what loving contact actually requires from you. Sometimes the most relational thing you can do is stop offering a version of yourself that looks available but isn't. Stop handing out emotional rain checks when your body is going to bounce that check later. That is not selfishness. That is integrity. And no, this does not guarantee your partner will respond perfectly. They may feel disappointed. They may need a minute. They may be used to the old version of the dance. That does not mean the shift is wrong. It simply means the pattern is being interrupted. And when a long-standing pattern shifts, there is usually a wobble. Growth is uncomfortable like that. But there is a big difference between disappointing someone in a moment and disappearing from yourself over time. One creates a temporary discomfort. The other slowly erodes the connection. If you zoom out for a moment, this pattern is not really about bad boundaries. It is about what your nervous system had learned was required for people to stay connected. Somewhere along the way, many people absorbed the message that love is maintained by accommodating, understanding, being flexible, and low maintenance. You become the person who can hold more, the person who stretches a little further, the person who keeps the emotional temperature steady. And for a long time, that may have genuinely helped relationships function. But strategies that once protected connection can actually quietly start limiting it when they become the only way the bond knows how to operate. Because when one person consistently absorbs the tension so the relationship stays calm, something subtle begins to happen under the surface. There is less honesty about capacity, less clarity about what each person can actually hold, less room for the relationship to adjust in a balanced direction. And more resentment grows. Not because anyone is actually intending harm, but because the system has learned a rule. This person will stretch. So if parts of this episode felt familiar, the takeaway is not that you need to become stricter, colder, or less loving. The takeaway is that relationships become healthier when both people are visible inside of them, including their limits. When your capacity is allowed to matter, the connection becomes more accurate. Sometimes that means the rhythm slows down. Sometimes conversations happen later instead of right now. Sometimes your partner has to feel a little more of the space between you instead of you immediately filling it. Those shifts can feel unfamiliar at first, but unfamiliar is not the same thing as wrong. And here's the quiet truth underneath all of this. A relationship that only works when you override yourself is not actually stable. Real stability happens when both people show up honestly, including when they reach the edge of their capacity. That kind of connection may not always look perfectly smooth in the moment. There may be pauses, there may be adjustments, there may be tension or conflict, but over time, it becomes much more resilient. If you want the guided version of this work, my private audio series is linked in the show notes. You can start anytime. That's it for today's episode of Coupled With. Thank you so much for spending this time with me. If this episode resonated with you, I'd love for you to hit subscribe so you never miss what's next. And if you found it helpful, please share it with a friend or leave a quick rating and review. It really helps more than you know. And if you're curious about how we might work together or want more resources to strengthen your relationship, head over to my website, www.drrachelorleck.com. You'll find free tools, podcast extras, and ways to go deeper. Thanks again for listening, and I'll see you next time.